Example 6. Establish the identity tangent of V plus the cotangent of V all over the secant of V times the cosecant of V is equal to 1. All right, clearly the left side here is more complicated than the right side. So we're going to start there. Okay, so I'm going to write down the left side, which is tangent of V plus the cotangent of V over the secant of V times the cosecant of V. Okay, so now we need to use basic trigonometric identities plus algebraic manipulation to generate a series of equivalent expressions until we get to the right side, which is 1. Okay, now when you look at this quantity on the left, okay, you may be puzzled. What do I do here? Okay, I think the best bet, this quantity is a single fraction. I think the best bet here is to break up the fraction and take it from one fraction and turn it into two fractions, okay? Remember, I've told you a couple of times, the correct way to properly break up a fraction is to take each quantity in the top and divide by the entire denominator. Okay, so I'm going to take the first quantity in the top, which is the tangent of V, and I am going to divide by the entire denominator, which is the secant of V times the cosecant of V. Okay, and then I'm going to keep the plus sign in the middle, and then I'm going to take the other quantity in the numerator, which is the cotangent of V, and divide it by the entire denominator. Okay, so we've taken the single fraction and now we've broken it up correctly into two different fractions. Okay, from here, there is a lot going on. I see a tangent, I see a secant, I see a cosecant, I see a cotangent. Nothing sticking out as far as like Pythagorean identities. I think the best case here would be to turn everything into sines and cosines. Okay. All right, so let's get started. All right, so let me start with the first fraction. In the numerator, I've got tangent of V. Okay, so that's going to be sine of V over the cosine of V. Okay, so that's the new numerator. The denominator here is going to be the secant of V, so that's going to be 1 over the cosine of V times the cosecant of V, which is 1 over the sine of V. Okay, so that is the first fraction turned completely into sines and cosines. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for the second fraction. So I'm going to add the cotangent of V. The cotangent of V is the cosine of V over the sine of V over the denominator here is going to be the secant of V, which is 1 over the cosine of V, times the cosecant of V, which is 1 over the sine of V. Okay, so this looks pretty complicated. All right, everything is written in terms of sines and cosines. That was one of the tips for establishing an identity. Okay, all right, let's go back to the first fraction here. Okay, I am going to leave the first fraction alone here, the top fraction, sine of V divided by the cosine of V. Okay, and then the denominator, you're multiplying two fractions, so I'm going to go ahead and do that multiplication. I'm going to multiply the top. 1 times 1 is 1. That's going to be over the denominator, so just multiply the denominators together. That's going to be the cosine of V times the sine of V. Okay. I am going to continue working with this mess instead of jumping over here. Okay, I'll come back to the right side of the plus sign after we get a little further with this particular mess. Okay, all right, so now I'm basically dividing two fractions. Okay, so that means I need to take the top fraction and leave it alone. So the sine of V over the cosine of V. Okay, change the division to multiplication and then flip the other fraction. Okay, so if I flip the other fraction in the top, I'm going to get cosine of V times the sine of V, and then I'll have a 1 in the bottom. Okay, all right, so then what I can do, you're multiplying fractions now, so you can just multiply across the top and multiply across the bottom. Okay, so this is going to be, if I look across the top, I've got sine V times sine V, so that's going to turn into sine squared V times the cosine of v. In the bottom, cosine of v times 1 is cosine of v. And then you're going to get a cosine v in the top, 1 in the bottom. They cancel. And so that fraction on the left, that big mess, simplified to be the sine squared of v. Okay? We're going to do the same thing to the fraction that is to the right of the plus sign. Okay, so we have to come back up here and simplify this mess. Okay, it's going to be very similar. Okay, all right, so I'm going to pick up where I left off. There's still going to be a plus sign in the middle. Okay, all right, so now I'm working with cosine of v over the sine of v all over 1 over the cosine of v times 1 over the sine of v. Okay, we're going to do what we did, is basically paralleling the steps from the previous fraction. Okay, we're going to leave the numerator alone, cosine of v over the sine of v. And then in the denominator, we are multiplying two fractions. So if we multiply across the top, 1 times 1 is going to give us 1. Multiply across the bottom, cosine of v times the sine of v. That's going to be cosine of v times the sine of v. Okay, that means you're now dividing two fractions. So we're going to go ahead and perform that division. Bring down the plus sign in the middle of the two big fractions. Okay, so we're going to leave the numerator alone, cosine of v over the sine of v. Okay, change the division to multiplication, flip the bottom fraction to cosine of v times the sine of v over 1. Okay, now you're multiplying fractions. Okay, so in the next step, bring down the plus sign in the middle. Okay, we're going to multiply across the top and across the bottom. Okay, when you multiply across the top, you've got the cosine of v times the cosine of v. That's going to be the cosine squared of v times the sine of v. Okay, that's the new numerator. The bottom is the sine of v times 1, which is the sine of v. Okay, now you've got a sine v in the top, 1 in the bottom. They cancel, and that's going to leave you with cosine squared of v. And don't forget the plus sign in the middle. Okay, so we are left with, coming back as a whole, okay, we are left with sine squared of v plus the cosine squared of v. And we know from the Pythagorean identity that is equal to 1. Okay, and guess what? That's the right side of the equation that we were trying to get to. Okay, so we have proven or verified this identity.